On Monday morning, when I found out that Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was burning, I felt sick to my stomach. How could this be happening? I have been blessed twice in my lifetime to be able to have seen the beautiful cathedral, because when you walk in, the first thing you notice are the rose windows. They take your breath away. And before you know it, you are utterly humbled in this beautiful and holy place of worship. When I continued to watch the pictures where fire was burning out of places that used to have beautiful stained glass windows, and when I saw the images of the entire roof and spire burning, I was overcome with even a deeper loss. I realized that my husband and my parents and my younger brother would never get to see the entire glory of Notre Dame Cathedral. They would not be able to experience the holiness and the sacredness that I experienced because they have never been to Paris. I guess in that moment I realized how much was stolen. Opportunities in the future to enjoy that with my spouse, to have my family see the beautiful flying buttresses, the beautiful cross, the magnificent organ, the amazing statues, and to hear the bells of Notre Dame Cathedral. So much opportunity lost by a catastrophic fire caused by an accident. But Notre Dame is not the only church that has been affected by unimaginable loss. In the past couple of weeks, 3 churches in Louisiana were utterly damaged and destroyed by arson. These 3 churches were consumed by fire over a 10-day period. St. Mary's Baptist Church, Greater Union Baptist Church, and Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. These 3 churches are long-standing pillars in the African American community. And while we don't know the motives of the arsonist at this point, we cannot help but name that these are truly evil acts. All 4 of these churches lost generations of family, community, and cultural history. All of these are active, thriving churches where weddings and funerals and baptisms occur. These are sacred places where people could come, utter their prayers to God, and find connection to their Creator. These are places where pilgrims who are weary and tired can come and seek rest from their lives. These places were a place where people could come and expect to hear a comforting and hope-filled word from God. Now, future generations have been robbed of knowing these places of sanctuary, these places of safety, these places where their ancestors journeyed in their faith. And looking at these pictures and images of destruction, we cannot help to feel the intimate connection to the despair and loss and grief we have in our own lives. It makes it all more connected and intimate and feel that much more great. And during times like these, where everything already feels turned upside down, to see another thing being destroyed, another thing crumble, another thing being reduced to ashes, we cannot be just a little bit defeated and think, well, this is how it's going to be. Why is it that destruction always wins? Why is it that hopelessness always comes out on top? Why is this our reality. And day in and day out, when all you see are images of death and destruction, hate and violence, tragedy, we cannot help but realize it is too hard to hold on to hope. So we are left believing what you see is what you get. And it is so hard when all you see is death and destruction. It's hard to create that space to imagine, God, where are you? God, are you doing anything new within this? And so the good news this morning, this Easter morning, is that while Easter starts in death and darkness, it transitions into a living hope as our sight is restored. Everything is not as it seems. We cannot just be satisfied at looking at the surface level of our lives. And it is not what you see is what you get. Now, even in the most difficult of times, darkness and despair, we seek out God. And even though we seek out God in our own limited ways, Easter reminds us that God still shows up. God still shows up. God still has a word for us today. And God still sends us to proclaim the good news of this Easter, that Jesus and his love for the world has conquered death once and for all. Jesus has conquered evil and proclaimed that love has the final word. Thus, we today can boldly hope in the face of hopeless circumstances because we as children of God know who has the last word. Because Jesus rose from the grave, we as people of faith can confidently look past the surface level of our lives, knowing that God is not done. God is not done acting. God is not done speaking. God is not done with us. And so because God is not done, neither are we. And so we know that God is making all things new in our world. Alleluia. This morning, we find some common humanity with Mary Magdalene. As she is one of Jesus' disciples, we watch her grief over his death limit her ability to hope beyond what she can currently see. And what she can currently see is death and a graveyard. And so after the devastating news of Good Friday, Mary seeks Jesus in the last place she saw him and in the condition how she left him. So prior to meeting Jesus, we're told in the Gospels that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons within her. You can just imagine how she was treated by her fellow human beings. Condemned, ostracized, ignored, isolated. Probably treated less than a full human person. So when Jesus shows up in her life, sees her, casts out these demons, and brings healing upon her life so that she can know wholeness and fullness of the life that God intended for her, she is set free. Not only is she set free from the demons, but to be seen, to be known, to be loved, to be advocated for, to be cared for. Jesus welcomes her willingly as a member of his flock. Where she knew isolation, with him she knew home. And so in relationship with Jesus, her entire life is transformed. Her whole future is wide open. But on that Good Friday, it felt like everything that he had given to her died when he died on the cross. Good Friday confirmed her worst fears. Might makes right. Peace has little chance. Power will always overcome compassion. Despair will extinguish any flicker of hope. The rich are just going to keep getting richer, and all who are weak are going to suffer under one form of Pontius Pilate or another. And it confirmed the worst of her fears. that dead people stay dead. So of course she comes to the tomb expecting to find Jesus in the same place she left him and in the same condition. Because how could she come and expect something more? So when she approaches his tomb and sees that the stone has been rolled away, she doesn't assume that he has risen from the grave, but instead she makes the assumption someone has stolen his body. So she runs and tells Simon Peter and John, the beloved disciple, "Come, someone has taken his body and I don't know where they've laid him." So they all rush back to the tomb, and the disciples look in, and all they see are his grave clothes. And then the disciples head on back. They can't do anything in this moment. But Mary stays. She takes one more look into the tomb and she sees two angels sitting there, and they ask her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" But she can't even engage with them and fathom what is going on, because that's how intense her grief is. She just wanted to be with him one last time. And even that was stolen from her. It's those moments in our lives where really, could the bottom drop out even more? Why is it always gets worse and worse? And so she grieves. Now, in seeking Jesus in the same place and in the same condition, she risks not seeing the risen Christ. When she turns around from the empty tomb, she encounters Jesus, the one she has been looking for, but she can't see him. Isn't it interesting how hopeless circumstances in our lives have a way of blinding us from seeing God showing up in our midst? I'm going to say it again because I know someone's got to hear it this morning. How is it that when hopeless circumstances are amongst us, that they continue to blind us, blind our eyes, blind our trust, that God is actually showing up in our midst? So she mistakes him for the gardener, because in her mind there's no way that could be Jesus speaking to her. But Jesus still shows up there for her, offering her comfort when he asks her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" He is on the verge of telling her the good news that's going to take her sorrow and turn it into joy. But so she responds, "Sir, if you've carried away, just tell me where you've laid him and I will take him away." She still cannot recognize the one who is speaking to her is the one she's been looking for. How often do we do this in our own lives, where we risk seeing God showing up in our midst because we actually don't believe that God will show up in our hopeless situations? Now, we know that God has acted in our past. We're grateful for the ways that God has acted in our past. Those times where God's love has carried us through, healed us or delivered us from an illness or a loved one from illness, carried us through a horrible job situation, only to then bring us into a job that is life-giving. How often in our past has God moved us from sorrow to joy, from despair to hope, from exhaustion to renewal? There's two reasons why we are not able to trust that in our present trial, that God will actually show up one more time for us. The first reason is this. We think that what God did in the past, that's good and done. God's like, "You had your chance. I'm done with you. I've moved on to some other people." And so we think in our present trial, God has abandoned us to our circumstances, as hopeless as they are. And so while we're in the midst of these fiery trials, we think there's no way that God's going to show up in this. And so we will be consumed by this experience, and that God will abandon us. We think our experience in our present trial will be the final strike, that this will be the last word. But we know that God has the last word. The second reason why we have a hard time trusting that God will show up in our present trials is because we, like Mary, get fixated that God's got to show up in the same way that God showed up in the past and in the same format. And what happens? is that we get really disappointed. God, you were there for me then. Why are you not here for me now? And God's actually saying, I am here for you in a new way. But you're so fixated on me performing the same way I did in the past that you are not open to seeing me in your present. All the while, we too, like Mary, miss seeing God in our midst because we think God cannot show up in a place, in the places we never expect God to be. But the good news this Easter morning is that even when we cannot see God in our hopeless circumstances, that God still shows up in your life, that God has not abandoned you like you feared. We are not alone. God is with us. Hallelujah. Now the risen Jesus has a word for Mary when he calls her by name. Mary. It's just a name, but it's her name. It's her name. And when Jesus calls her by name, she knows it's her God and her good shepherd. And what Jesus told us about the relationship between the good shepherd and his sheep is that the sheep will know his voice. And he calls them by name and welcomes them back into the flock. Those who are lost will be found. And so when Jesus calls her by name, she discovers her worst fears are nothing because she is still known. She is still loved, and hearing his voice wipes away all of her tears. Her heart is lifted in a way she never thought possible again. And so despite all of her efforts to find him, it's not a bit surprising that the Good Shepherd found her. And so Mary is empowered to turn around and proclaims, "Teacher," and the scales of sorrow and despair fall from her eyes. She can clearly see now that her teacher and Lord is with her in a new way. She takes stock of everything around her. Everything takes on new meaning. The grave clothes that were in Jesus' tomb are not there because someone took his body away. They're there because Jesus left death behind. The stone that tried to seal Jesus in the tomb for eternity was once and for all time rolled away because nothing can contain the love of God. Jesus defeats the power of death in him because the world meets the power of love of God incarnate. It's not all over as she thought. It's not all over as we thought. Jesus is alive, which means Mary's life and future is not over. The life he gave to her when he first met her is still an option. It is still her future and her joy. And the truth is, for us, in our hopeless circumstances, our life and our future is not over either. Death does not have the final word. God does. And is God's word for you this day that if all you can see is destruction and despair and you can barely hold on to hope, know that your God is reliable, not in the future, but right here and right now. And that God can be counted on, not only to rescue you in your past or rescue you in your future, but to rescue you in your present, to give you joy and hope in the midst of your suffering, because Jesus is alive. Now, Mary seeks to hold on to Jesus, but he tells her, don't hold on to me. I'm not done ascending to the Father. You've got a task to do. So Jesus sends her and tells her you need to proclaim the joy of the Easter message, that he is not dead. He has conquered the grave and is alive. And she's the first person to proclaim the good news of Easter, that we are living in a resurrected world, where God's love is victorious over death and evil. The hope of Christ has overcome despair. The light of Christ has defeated darkness. Christ is risen. And that's why, in the face of tragic destruction All 4 churches have committed to rebuilding because they know that tragedy and acts of evil do not have the last word. God does. These congregations know how vitally important it is for them to continue to be a sanctuary where pilgrims know the rest of God, where people who are living in despair and hopelessness can hear a word from God and be set free. That is why they rebuild. Not just because of the beautiful structures, but because they know their places are a place where people can know the love of God and build a relationship with their Creator. Reverend Gerald Toussaint, one of the pastors of the churches that were burned down in Louisiana, said this: "A lot of people want to make this a hate thing. Well, we don't represent hate. We represent love. And that's how we are all moving forward, with Jesus' love that has the last word. All 4 of these churches represent a love that is known to overcome hate, a love that is known to overcome death, a love that is known to overcome tragedy, a love that is known to forgive and reconcile. And the truth is, the world needs to know this love. I know I do, I know you do, and I know the people beyond our walls need to know this love is more powerful than death, evil, sin, violence, and hatred. And so that's why these churches rebuild. But the question remains for you to decide this morning. Will you continue to be satisfied with taking in your life and believing what you see is what you get? Will you continue to see the surface level and think, well, that's all there is? Will you continue to allow the images of death, destruction, pain, and hopelessness consume your vision? Will it steal your trust in God, that God can show up in the midst of those things? Or will you dare this morning to have an Easter-filled vision, one filled with hope, fully confident that no matter what suffering you are experiencing in this moment, that God is still showing up. God still has a life-giving word for you, and that God is still sending you to proclaim the good news of Easter. Do you believe that God is not done with your life and with your story? Do you believe that your future is wide open? I know I do. Christ, our hope, is alive and well. Christ is risen.